Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this live discussion on bullying and sexual harassment in the workplace, brought to you by the Bermuda government. My name is Antonia Holder, and I will be your moderator this evening. The Employment Amendment Act 2020 has introduced a number of changes to the Employment Act 2000 that will strengthen the rights and obligations of employees and employers in Bermuda. The proposed changes were incorporated to maintain at least a minimum best practice standard aligned with the International Labour Organization, addressing some of the problems within the current legislation regarding ambiguity and the lack of 21st century best practices. We are here tonight to discuss some of these changes and the positive impact. Tonight, we have a number of expert panelists joining us this evening, and I will be introducing each of them prior to their respective talks. But first, to begin our discussion this evening, we're going to be hearing from the Minister of Labour, the Honourable Jason Hayward JP MP. Minister, please step up to.
Good evening. Welcome to the Bermuda government's Facebook Live session on bullying and sexual harassment in the workplace. Personally, I consider the mandating of policies against bullying and sexual harassment in the workplace as one of the major adjustments in sexual harassment, while also having the appropriate protocols in place to deal with such actions and demonstrate the zero tolerance approach that employers should have towards this behavior. And so it is important that we hold this online session to share information and give members of the public the opportunity to have your questions answered so everyone can understand how this policy impacts employers and employees. I can share with you that in Bermuda, the prevalence of bullying and harassment in the workplace is alarming. Also, many bullying and sexual harassment cases are not reported out of fear of retaliation, being ostracized or blacklisted, and the distress of recounting and reliving the trauma caused by the experience. As of June 1st, 2021, employers are required to have a zero tolerance policy statement for bullying and sexual harassment in the workplace, and recourse for employees for any contravention of the policy. The Ministry of Labour has assisted employers by providing them with a template policy statement and template investigation procedures to allow their businesses to conduct themselves accordingly. All employees must be presented with a policy statement, and the employer is to help ensure employees understand it. Any employer who contravenes this requirement will be liable to a civil penalty imposed by the Labor Relations Manager or the Employment Labor Tribunal. Policies are an effective step to mitigate the occurrence of violence and harassment in the workplace. We must all work towards eradicating unacceptable behaviors, including bullying and sexual harassment, from the world of work. These amendments are a start, but ultimately it is our responsibility to treat everyone fairly and with respect and dignity. Thank you. I will now hand the reins over to our forum moderator, Ms. Antonia Holder.
Thank you, Minister, for that introduction. Okay, so for this evening, as I mentioned, we have a number of panelists. I will invite each of them to take the stage for them to discuss how their organization supports this new legislation and how they can offer their services to anyone who needs it. Up first, we have Mrs. Lisa Reed, Human Rights Commission. As the National Human Rights Institution for Bermuda, the Human Rights Commission is a non-ministry public authority whose mission is to eliminate discrimination and harassment through advocacy, education, and enforcement. While the Commission is a complaints handling authority, it also serves as a public resource to help stakeholders understand human rights obligations and compliance under the Human Rights Act 1981. The executive officer is the head of the public authority and charged with statutory powers to investigate complaints of discrimination, along with ensuring the continuity of the effective operation of the Commission. Mrs. Lisa Reed, please step to the stage.
Thank you, Antonia. First of all, I would like to thank Minister Hayward and the team at Workforce Development for the invitation to join in this discussion this evening. The Human Rights Commission recognizes that compliance duties may feel overwhelming, and yet experiences of sexual harassment and bullying in the workplace can have devastating and far-reaching consequences. Environments free from harassment and discrimination is both an essential duty and an opportunity. The government's amendments to the Employment Act are significant, as this demonstrates a national commitment to preventing discrimination, bullying, and harassment from occurring within the workplace. The Commission strongly values such commitments that seek to safeguard the inherent dignity of our community. And so fortifying rights in one area helps to strengthen them in others and normalizes the expectation of upholding the individual rights and creating a healthy workplace environment. The highest number of intakes received by the Commission year after year is in the area of employment, including allegations of harassment, sexual harassment, and bullying. The new amendments reinforce the duty of employers to ensure that their employees can expect to work in environments free of various forms of harassment. Bullying is not referenced within the Human Rights Act. In fact, up until now, there was no legislative protection against bullying. The bullying provisions now under the Employment Act increase protection in an area where individuals may approach the Commission with allegations of harassment that were not tied to a protected ground within the Act. For example, harassment because you are a woman, or because of a criminal record, or because of a disability, or another protected ground. Bullies tend to be indiscriminate in their bullying. They do it because they can, and it may not be due to a protected ground, which means the Human Rights Act may offer protection where it is linked to a discriminatory behavior. The amendments will help normalize the expectation of a zero-tolerance policy towards harassment and bullying in the workplace. Embedding these expectations in our employment legislation helps emphasize that this is a standard expectation of the labor contract for everyone. However, legislation is just the first step. The work is in understanding and communicating these expectations, educating ourselves, and fostering a culture where this behavior is simply not acceptable. Every member of the organization should know what to do if they think it has occurred. And this is where the policy which the government has issued comes into play. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, very much for that information on the Human Rights Commission and how you can help assist everyone. You're absolutely right. Communicating the expectations of the new amendments to the Act is of utmost importance. Everyone was actually required to have a policy in place by June 1st. And if you need assistance up until today, please feel free to reach out to the respective parties. I want to remind you that you can ask any questions you have at any point in time during this discussion. Just pop it in the chat and my team will get it to me and I will address it to the respective speakers. Up next to the stage, I'd like to invite Mrs. Letitia Lister-Burgess with the Employee Assistance Program. The EAP Bermuda provides counseling, crisis management, creating and delivering of workshops, management consultations, and policy development. Mrs. Lister-Burgess joined the Employee Assistance Program of Bermuda in 2012 and became the Executive Director in August 2018. She is a certified family therapist and is credentialed as a clinical fellow through the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. She is currently the only certified employee assistance professional in Bermuda, having received this certification in 2015. Let's welcome to the stage Mrs. Letitia Lister-Burgess.
Thank Thank you. Again, I would also like to say thank you for this invitation to talk about this very important topic. I've heard people ask, why do we need to talk about it at this point? So for context, between January 1st and May 30th of this year, EAP received 500 new cases. Of those 500 cases, 105 of them were work-related. Now, that may range from being dissatisfied with a manager, having an issue with your work schedule, whatever is happening. But one of the things we see coming up again and again is situations where people feel that they are being bullied in the workplace and don't know what their rights are in addressing it. Who do they talk to? How do they navigate it? How do they figure out their ongoing relationships on a day-to-day basis? And this is where EAP Bermuda can get involved. Now, we represent over 200 different companies on island, which roughly comes to about 16,000 working people. So for many people in Bermuda, we are that resource for them. And so we can support an organization in many different ways. We can help you with training and education. We do a training on bullying in the workplace, incivility in the workplace, sexual harassment and understanding it. But the other biggest part of that is really looking at how your policies that are developed can tie into actually supporting staff and having the resource of EAP. So I know for some companies, for example, when an investigation is finished, the bully and the victim have both been referred to EAP. The victim for supportive counseling, understanding what happened, making sense of the investigation, figuring out how to navigate continually in this work environment. For the bully, for understanding their own actions, what impact it has had on their career, and how to do differently so that they do not end up continuing this behavior in the future. The other thing that's really important is, as a manager, utilizing our management consultation service, where a manager can call us and ask, how do they help support their team when these issues arise? How do we look at that so that you don't create a culture of bullying, what's known as organizational bullying, institutional bullying, where it's become so normalized that people start to think this is just how this organization functions. And I have seen some examples on island where people have had issues where, whether it's at another employee, whether it's a manager, where they felt bullied and they didn't feel capable or didn't feel encouraged to actually make a complaint because they felt they would be blacklisted or their own company, their own reputation would be at stake. And so one of the things that this new legislation and the adjustments to it have put in place is it gives people a protection mechanism where they can now hold their company accountable to what they're actually saying. So if your company says, I have a zero tolerance towards these issues, here's the policy to back it up. And so for employees, this creates a culture where you can hold people not only accountable, but there's a framework of understanding what the complaint process is, what the timeline is, and how, what resources are put in place. And I think it's really important that organizations take this opportunity to utilize this well. So whether it's policy creation, how do I really put this in place? How does EAP stand next to it? We would love to be a part of your journey. And as I said, you can send people as a formal supervisory referral, as a compassionate referral for someone trying to, really make sense of how they've been upended in this situation. And then also just really adjusting how the company culture really looks at these kind of situations. So whether it's management consultations, whether it's training, whether it's counseling and support, there are many different arenas that EAP can show up and support in so that you can have the healthy and encouraging place for people to work. At the end of the day, we all work a lot of hours and you want to create an environment where people want to show up and do the work and not be sidetracked by issues of bullying or sexual harassment. Thank you.
Thank you, Letitia. You touched on a very important topic, which is the fear of retaliation that a lot of employees, and in some cases, employers, upper management, face, and therefore lead them to not wanting to make a statement in any way. You mentioned the support of the counseling in that regard. Could you give us an example of how you have helped to shift the dynamics of that sort of situation in a culture that has institutionalized bullying?
So that's really a great question, because often people think, if I say something, what is going to blow back on myself? So I'm thinking of a specific organization where they really did have an issue with institutional bullying, and the employees working with their union and organization had put forward that they really wanted to have something shift. And so we started with training from management to the employees to really lay out what was bullying, what should be happening, what a complaint process could look like. So everybody was clear and understood what was and wasn't acceptable behavior. After that, there was also a shift then of working with their HR to look at, okay, what kind of management trainee opportunities need to be put in place so that managers themselves can know how to navigate this when it comes up, how to formally handle complaints, how to actually talk to people when they are bullying other people, because often the assumption is made that because someone is a manager, they have the people skills and the conflict management skills to handle heavy topics, and that's not always true. So that part we were also able to utilize. And then also with the organization, when they did have issues with bullying, this time they had it built into their process that when anyone was accused, there was supportive counseling that was offered for the person who was accused and for the person who was making the accusation. Now, it was not mandatory, but it was helping both parties to understand what may have led to this moment. If someone was in fact found to, at the end of an investigation, be guilty of those issues, then a formal supervisory referral came in place so that this behavior would not continue. So if you look at those three prongs, it really wrapped around an organization to really look at what is happening on the employee level, what is happening on the manager level, but also what's happening for the whole culture of the company to really address how do we make a shift happen. And that company went from, and they did everything they needed to do. They really trained their managers. They really started holding people accountable, and their internal surveys started to see that shift. So within a 5-year period, people went from having a 20% satisfaction in the company to they reported last year an 80% satisfaction in the company. And so those are the direct kind of things that you can track to see if it's having an actual impact on the company itself.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And so just a follow-up question, would you consider a 5-year turnaround for a culture shift of this magnitude normal? I mean, is it on the shorter end? Is it on the longer end?
I think it depends on how serious a company is about doing the work. There are some companies that have just said, as of today, we have a 0 tolerance, and we're going to make sure everyone understands what that looks like. The best part of that is training. So everybody's on the same page. And then after that, it's really holding people accountable. So I've seen some companies make a shift within, 30 days because it was very clear that we're now going to live up to our policy. And I've seen some companies take a couple of years because they're not really prepared to do the work to live up to the policy. I think now, in light of the recent legislative changes, it will be quicker shifts, because even if management and employees aren't necessarily eye on what that means, there's now a country awareness that puts a very different lens to see this in. And so people can say, hey, my company does this, other companies don't do that. Should we be doing something different? So we now have so I'm hoping that it doesn't take people 5 years. I would love to see more companies have that under 1 year radical 0 tolerance shift, and it's entirely possible.
Great, thank you so much. I'm sure we will be speaking a little bit more on this. It is a very hot topic, specifically with retaliation. We had a question come in about how you can obtain the fact sheet that I spoke about earlier. It is found on gov.bm/labor-relations-office. It's on the specific labor relations page. They have the fact sheets as well as the template summary. I'd like to go ahead and introduce our next panelist, Mr. Scott Pierman. He is from the Bermuda Hospitals Board. Scott Pearman is the Deputy Chief Executive Officer at the Bermuda Hospitals Board with chief level responsibilities for human resources. Scott, please step up to the stage.
Great, thank you very much, Antonia, and good evening, Bermuda. Firstly, I would like to applaud the Ministry of Labor for taking the critical steps to modernizing our legislation. But the work really begins now, because just by placing it on the legislation, into legislation is not going to change what happens in the workplace. It's now up to we as employers to start to take the bull by the horn and lead, as well as for our managers, as well as our employees to support the initiative. That's the only way that we're going to accelerate change, as Letitia spoke to. I think the Bermuda Hospitals Board serves a unique role on this panel because we're the only employer that is here to speak about our journey. And certainly we're not holding ourselves out as being perfect, but what we would like to do is share what our experience has been in attempting to change the course as far as workplace satisfaction. And certainly it's appropriate to acknowledge Minister Jason Hayward, who in early 2017, in his capacity as General Secretary of the Bermuda Public Services Union, approached the hospital and offered to partner with us on combating harassment and bullying. And really at that time, we had a choice. We could have stuck our head in the sands or say, all right, we have a problem, let's work with the union. The reality is we were facing challenges with harassment and bullying from a standpoint of manager to staff, peer to peer, junior colleagues to guest workers. And we have such a diverse organization that we were actually experiencing imported caste conflicts, imported political discrimination, and then of course sexual harassment had been identified in certain segments. Admittedly, we had areas that were deemed toxic work environments, meaning work units where the workplace has an unacceptable level of low employee satisfaction, managerial function, frustration, above average sick leave and grievances, to name a few symptoms. In order to break a culture of a toxic work environment, you need organizational-wide commitment. And we began that by first getting our executive team on board. Jason and I presented to our executive team as well as to the board, because without that top-end leadership support, then your employees will know that it's hollow. When we rolled out the policy, we also included included videotaped support from our then CEO, Ms. Vanetta Simons, and the president of the BIU, Mr. Chris Furbett. And then Jason and I led 34 two-hour presentations over the course of the next 6 months, which were mandatory for all employees. I think we still own royalties on that work. So some of the features of the policy were the BHB committed to zero tolerance for harassment and bullying. The policy applied to all staff, and often managers think they're excluded from that. We also committed to a set of investigative guidelines, education, and support for staff, implemented a disciplinary policy, and committed to take action when there was appropriate evidence that harassment or bullying had occurred in the workplace. So we defined harassment as being a violation linked to the human rights section 2 that include age, race, culture, ethnic, national origin, sexual orientation, religious belief, or disability. Of course, we had a separate standing policy on sexual harassment. Then bullying was characterized as those behaviors which were offensive, intimidating, malicious, or insulting behavior, and abuse or misuse of power, through means intended to undermine, threaten, or injure the recipient. And then based on recommendations from the American Nurse Association, we extended our policy to cover workplace incivility, which is antisocial workplace behavior, which is perceived as rude, discourteous, impolite, alienating, or possibly violating the norms of good behavior, okay? For basically doing the things that your mother probably taught you not to do. So incivility covers insults, derogatory remarks, intentional embarrassment, whether that's public or private, intimidating behavior, intrusion of personal space or threatening behavior, repeating or spreading harmful rumors or stories about individuals, giving dirty looks or even eye rolling, okay? And incivility was important because the bullying tends to require a higher standard of offense, okay? But, you know, bad behavior starts, and you can do the little things, and you know what little things to do to people that still has the impact of people feeling unwanted in the workplace. So we felt that it was important as an organization that we defined incivility and made that area of offense. So what was our focus when we wrote it out to staff? We discussed with staff the impact of HBI on our work environment. So we shared stats from our employee surveys. We reinforced leadership's commitment to addressing matters in the workplace and working with our unions, because if you already have a problem in the workplace, then your employees have concluded management is either ignoring it or not able to do anything about it. So you actually have to recommit, and recommit very publicly. It's not good enough to put it in a piece of paper. You have to go out and really across those 34 sessions, it was a lot of testimony by the leaders of the organization. And that works. You know, as recently as maybe 2 months ago, I was stopped coming out of the elevator at 6 p.m. and an employee said, "Mr. Pearman, I remember when you said to come and bring up issues of harassment." Okay, so it's good that you empower your employees to hold you to account. And we actually had protocols for employees if they felt harassed or bullied, so it gave them options. Again, when you're dealing with a situation where somebody who's being harassed or bullied, they're actually the victim in the situation. And so you have to provide tools that assist the victim in empowering themselves, okay? And part of that was we established what was called an HBI advisor program. And we selected through a nomination and review process, employees who are peers who will be HBI advisors. And we're still developing it, but what we do is we deploy the peers throughout the organization. So I could go to that individual and gain advice, and they could provide me guidance on how to engage through the formal process, or how to solve the issue in the workplace. So success and growth opportunities. Certainly the rollout of the policy was a success, reinforcing the discipline procedures and the HBI advisors. It has improved working relationships with the unions. Management is held to account, and we have to be seen to be taking action. It's improved accountability at the managerial staff level, okay? There continue to be opportunities, continue to building employee confidence in the process is day to day. I'm not sure if you ever achieve it, and if you do achieve it, it could be ruined in a minute. It's high risks when dealing with harassment cases, particularly sexual harassment, balancing between securing witnesses and potential false allegations. So that's always a tough case-by-case hurdle. Risk that harassment incidents may cause outbursts where the original victim is then held to account. So if you don't confront an issue or know that it's existing soon enough, sometimes nature takes its own course, and the wrong person may be held accountable for other actions that they might have taken contrary to organizational policy. Ensuring that there's witnesses, because ultimately the organization must be prepared to go through a natural justice process that could be sustained through the internal judicial procedure, any union or grievance mechanisms, or even in the courts. And the cost of grievance and legal cases related to pursuing or what arises out of sexual harassment cases. And that goes both ways, because even those persons who are held to account for harassment and bullying, they don't always agree that they were the offender. So that's why it's critical to be able to get the whole organization on board. So when there is something that happens that's untoward, you have your systems, your policies, as well as you're able to secure credible witnesses, and everybody has confidence to support the organization through that process. So that's a high-level overview of what we're attempting, and we continue to build on a day-by-day basis with our management team on behalf of our staff, and as well as behalf of the community that we serve.
Thank you very much, Scott, for giving us the summary of how you've been able to successfully implement the policy and reinforce it. We've had a question come through. You mentioned witnesses, that it's important for witnesses to understand the important role that they play. What do you say to someone who may be a victim of experiencing a level of sexual harassment or bullying, does not want to speak up for themselves, but someone witnesses it? Do they need to go to the person and say, hey, I've noticed that these are happening. I can advocate for you on your behalf? Does the witness go silently? And then separate to that, there is the element of, the victim goes in, in full control over making the complaint, and the witnesses are a part of it. So it's kind of like a two-part question.
So first of all, we are our brother's keeper. And if we see, each and every one of us has a responsibility that if we see one of our colleagues being subjected to abuse, then we are actually enabling that abuse if we do not stand up and show support. So I think that's a fundamental principle. From the standpoint of policy, we actually, through the HBI, provides actually an organizational release valve for employees to support. And then we also encourage our employees to support one another. And if you're fortunate enough to be in a union environment, then your union shop stewards and those organizations also play critical roles. And we've seen that in our organization, that there is great alignment between attempting to support persons through that process. So to us, it doesn't matter whether you go to your manager or your manager's manager, you go to a colleague, an HBI advisor, or your shop steward. Ultimately, what's important for us is that if you need support, you gain it. But everybody in that circle needs to have an understanding of that policy and commitment to support it.
Thank you very much. At this time, I'd like to move on to our next guest speaker, Mrs. Linda Bogle-Meinzer from the Bermuda Public Service Union. The union represents over 3,000 members made up of the public sector, private sector, and Quango workers. Mrs. Bogle-Meinzer is currently the second vice president of the Bermuda Public Service Union, and they are vested in labor relations and the representation of its members. Linda, we welcome you to the stage.
Thank you so much, and good evening, Bermuda, the rest of the panelists. It certainly is a privilege for myself on behalf of the union to talk about a topic that I personally am very passionate about, and also our union has become very passionate about, and it wasn't by chance. During 2016, we did a survey of our membership, and the data that came back was very disturbing. close to 50% of our membership said that they had experienced bullying and harassment in our bargaining units. Let that sink in. Close to 50% of the respondents of our survey said that they had experienced bullying and harassment in our bargaining units. 58% of the respondents said that they had witnessed bullying and harassment in the workplace. Disturbing figures. We did something that all people that are experiencing bullying and harassment want at the first instance. They want somebody to hear them, and they want somebody to believe them and then take action. Our union heard them, we believed them, and we took action. We went to Canada for a very intense bullying and harassment workshop, and then we came back and we instituted a campaign of anti-bullying and harassment. The former president, who is now the Minister of Labor, and myself, we were responsible for driving that campaign. That campaign was very vast, covering our bargaining units. Not only did we do that, and you would have heard Scott Pearman mention that he partnered with us to ensure that BHB started to deal with their high levels of bullying and harassment. But during the course of that campaign, right up to now, members have continued to support high levels of bullying and harassment. And so the reason why we're incredibly excited about this legislation, because now we have a definitive tool that we can use to support us to drive those organizations who have allowed bullying and harassment to go unaddressed. And I don't know if people, we can throw out the stats, we can talk about it on paper. But what I want Bermuda to do, and all the listening audience to do, is for a moment, I want you to close your eyes and imagine the impact of bullying and harassment when it is so bad that you physically get sick before you go to work every day. That you are so traumatized about having to put up with this that you constantly look in the mirror and debate whether or not you should continue to be with this employer. But here's the catch. And people have financial obligations. Some of the people in our bargaining units, our membership, are the sole breadwinners for the family. They have obligations for their children. So it's not an easy thing to be able to say, as some people have alluded, well, you could just leave. The BPSU has never supported that position. Our position has always been that people have a fundamental right to be treated with dignity and respect in the workplace. There is a mind shift that needs to take place. Sometimes people act like, I bet you if I asked everybody watching right now to remember back to when they were in primary school, high school, on the playgrounds, in the classroom, many of us experienced bullying and harassment. And it was difficult for us to deal with as children. Imagine now that you are an adult and you believe that as an adult, you should be able to deal with this, but you can't deal with this because you have reported it and nothing has happened. Your workplace colleagues are telling you things like, well, that's just how Linda is. It has become an acceptable norm for persons to casually touch you and come into your workspace. And then when you complain about it, you are re-victimized by saying, well, why are you saying that? Linda's such a nice person. Sure, she likes to, tug. That's how Bermuda is. We're just a touchy-feely kind of country. We need to make mind shifts. This legislation has drawn attention to it by saying the country is now taking it serious. It is for illegals around the coolers, at the lunch, and the lunch areas are now unacceptable. And so for us as a union, we become the enforcers of holding people accountable. And we have made it perfectly clear that we have a zero tolerance. So we don't care if it's employer, manager against employee. We don't care if it's an employee against each other. We don't care. We don't care if it's a patient coming in and harassing one of our workers. We have adopted a zero tolerance, and we will enforce that zero tolerance through the grievance process. But also, we created a post known as the Rapid Response Officer. So if you need instant help, immediate action, you can pick up your phone, call the BPSU, and ask for the Rapid Response Officer, who happens to be myself. We have been talking about it for a long time, and what this legislation now does is put some action behind it. And action is crucial. You want to believe that when you are brave enough, because that's what it requires in some environments, that when you are brave enough to put your hand up and say, I'm a victim, that you are going to get support. The BPSU has said, we are your support. We will carry you through, and we will hold those accountable. We've also said that it's important that persons realize that the ultimate goal is for the behavior to stop. The ultimate goal is for the behavior to stop. And so we have developed a series of presentations that we have done. Last week, we did about 5 presentations to our various bargaining units, and the reception has been incredible. Some people genuinely did not understand their behavior to be bullying and harassment or sexual harassment. They generally did not believe it to be so. And that's why education is crucial. What we've also done is had these real conversations about what it looks like on a daily basis. We understand because of the pandemic, because of the work situation, people are even more antsy because everybody wants to hold on to their job. But we've also helped people to understand that does not give you the right to say some of the things you say about our guest workers in this country. It certainly doesn't give you the right to say some of the things you say about our females in this country, about the people in the LGBTQI community, about people with different races and national origins. It doesn't give you the right. It is our responsibility as a union, but it is also our responsibility as individuals to have the hard conversation with ourselves to make sure that we're not a perpetrator. And sometimes what that looks like is monitoring now intentionally what comes out of your mouth in the presence of others. There was a question that came in about the witnesses. Witnesses are crucial. Witnesses are those persons who help authenticate that an incident did happen, but also they can also be used to empower and support people to realize that they have a right, that they have a right. We've also done a lot of work around what bullying and harassment looks like in terms of performance appraisals, in terms of job opportunities. You know, we talk about the big ticket items like sexual harassment and the gossip and the derogatory statements we make about each other. But there's also harassment that is used in how managers conduct performance appraisals, how managers hold workers to unrealistic expectations. And so we've done a lot of work around this topic, and we are here for our membership but we're also here for our bargaining units, because really, if we don't collectively make a decision to eradicate this out of our workplaces, we will be having this conversation another 5 years from now.
Thank you, Linda. Wow. Thank you so much for bringing a level of insight to the emotional trauma and impact that bullying and sexual harassment has on us as workers, as humans. There was a question that came up regarding what are the penalties for the perpetrators, those who are deemed to have in fact be harassing, whether it's sexually or non-sexually or bullying. What are some of the penalties? Sorry, go ahead.
No, the penalties vary according to the grievance, but the disciplinary code procedure, right? I mean, if depending on the nature of the incident, it could involve a verbal warning, it could involve a written warning, it could get to the point where a person gets suspended. And if the person is habitual and a habitual offender, it can lead to the loss of jobs. It is certainly our position that we don't want to get to the point where you have to lose your job. But at the same time, we do not want to change your behavior. People make choices and they have to be held accountable for their choices. So far, I can say that most of the incidents that we've dealt with, I don't recall any where the person got to the point where they had to lose their job. It takes time. You know, sometimes we come into work environments that are so toxic that it becomes the norm, that people just fall into a pattern of behavior. And so we understand it takes time, but at the end of the day, the behavior has to stop.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I'd like to take this opportunity to say welcome to those who have just joined in. We are hosting a forum right now on behalf of the Bermuda government on sexual harassment and bullying in the workplace. We are hearing from our guest panelists this evening. We are also being streamed live on Facebook, YouTube, and CITV. So welcome to you if you've just joined us. Picking back up with you, Linda, I want to make a statement about the ACT template that has been provided by the government. It is a template and the new legislation is the law, but it is considered minimum best practice. So employers have the room to implement other measures that they believe are useful for their working environment. And you have managed that you created a new post called Rapid Response Officer. So could you just elaborate a little bit more on the additional policies that businesses can sort of implement to help with mitigating some of these issues?
Well, certainly every business should have your basic anti-bullying policy. That's what the law mandates, right? But there also should be clear policies around the reporting procedure, right? So say, for example, if you're bullied by your immediate manager, the policy certainly shouldn't have the only option that you have to report to your line manager, because then that becomes problematic. And so in these reporting procedures, BHB is a perfect example, because you heard earlier that they created officers that you can report to that are independent, right? That may be something that companies can look at. I would say that the most important thing is to have an education piece around it, so that it is absolutely clear the minute you walk into that business that they have a zero tolerance. The policies in terms of what the penalties are for our bargaining units, we already have those in place. But once you step outside of our bargaining units, that is where the legislation becomes powerful.
Thank you very much, Linda. Before we move on to our last panelist, I would like to bring to the stage Letitia, who would like to make a comment on that as well.
So in listening to that question, I just wanted to add one thing. It's really important that your policies align with each other. So in fact, I'll even speak to EAP. When we were updating our own policies and procedures in light of this, we then also looked at our grievance policy again. We also looked at our whistleblowing policy. And so it's really important that none of these policies stand off and actually conflict with each other. So when you brought up the idea of who do you report to? So before, I used to say that you would report things to the executive director, but what if I am the issue? And so we put in mechanisms now where you can report to the executive director, or you can report to the board chair or the vice chair, and cleanly laid out how you contact them. Because often we find when we have these policies put in place where we say, okay, if this person is the problem, then you find this person, but you have no clue how to actually contact that person, say a board chair. And in fact, you'd have to come to me as the executive director to ask for their information. That creates a problem that we don't need. And so it's very important as you put in those layers that you make it clean and clear how people find that level of accountability. And so in the moment when people are stressed, they're not looking at, policies that are a little bit ambiguous. They know what is laid out cleanly for them. So have your policies all come together. Now's the time to look at your grievance policy, your whistleblowing policy, if you have one, and especially making sure that people understand who they would, put their complaint with, especially if it's the person who is just above them.
Thank you, Letitia. At this moment, I'd like to bring to the stage Mr. Keith Jensen, who is the president of the Bermuda.
End of this panel, and there isn't a lot left to be said. There's been a number of points raised which have been excellent, but I will, by design, have to repeat a couple of things and emphasize a couple of things that we've talked about tonight. It's so important that employers provide a good working environment for their staff. This working environment has to be free of toxic work atmosphere. It has to be an environment that improves performance, customer satisfaction, and reduces staff turnover. Effective policies make a difference in order for this to happen. Effective policies on sexual harassment and bullying make a huge difference within the organizations. You really can't have staff sitting there worrying about their future, their relationships with individuals, with their manager or colleagues, which from an employer's point of view, from which I'm speaking, is highly unproductive. You want the business to operate effectively and efficiently. And those effective policies in this particular area go a long way to make that happen. Most businesses in Bermuda that have, say, 10 to 49 employees, or even those larger employers over 50 employees, have had policies and procedures in place for a number of years concerning sexual harassment and bullying. They've had to review those policies as a result of this legislation. The legislation has introduced key ideas in terms of investigation, key ideas in terms of following procedures, and key ideas on how to make less intense staff. And there's some over 3,000 organizations of that size. Most often these employers are not going to have policies. Most often they're not going to have procedures. They may be family-oriented type businesses, and there could well be entrepreneurs that are working hard to make ends meet these days. These will be the most affected, I should say, persons or organizations by these policies. The law is the law, and they're going to have to do something about it and get it done. Because I would say that a number of small businesses that are watching this program tonight probably haven't done very much in this regard, and they better get going. When I talk about employers, it's not just those that are in business. Well, you may not think of it, but charities, churches, nonprofit organizations, and even government are employers. We don't often think of them as being employers, but they are. And these policies will have to be effective in those organizations. So if you're watching the program tonight and you're not too sure whether or not your organization is affected by these policies, please ask. And I'm certain the people in the ministry will be very helpful in that regard. One of the big things that comes across the employer's desk is going to be the need for training. And that's been touched on by several speakers already tonight. And I want to underscore that one more time, because sexual harassment and bullying require well-trained managers and persons to deal with it. They have to be well-trained in how to properly investigate a complaint, how to provide support that has been talked about tonight. And as a result of those investigations, to what extent are they going to take appropriate action with that person who may be not the victim, but the person who has actually been the one complained about and is found guilty, quote unquote, of this behavior. In addition, we've already talked about support for the individual employee, but also the investigation may show, as it has done in one or two cases, where the complaint might be false. And how is that going to be dealt with appropriately within the organization? Employee training also has to take place, which has already been touched on, as to what was considered to be acceptable behavior at one time is no longer acceptable. And that training may also deal with cultural differences, with those who are brought in on work permits. They may have a different cultural aspect to their upbringing that needs to be taken into account by the employers, and making sure that they still maintain an effective working environment and that culture doesn't start to affect the business itself. It's been mentioned that the ministry has a document on its website, and it's an excellent document. And it's very useful to employers and also to employees, but especially to employers who are responsible for making these policies effective. And so they have to go on that website, download that policy, and introduce it. In a nutshell, the new law has put an extreme amount of emphasis on sexual harassment and bullying, and it's given it a priority that we haven't had before. And employees from a business point of view, have got to minimize their risk. It's a basic philosophy of business to minimize their risk, and they need to take action to make sure that that happens. It's often thought that sexual harassment and bullying is management to employee or person of a higher authority to a lower authority, and often it is. But there's also cases, as you heard tonight, whereas employees may be acting inappropriately towards other employees. And also, we cannot forget the issue of bullying and harassment as may relate to same gender issues. There have been a number of examples that I mentioned tonight. I have a few more. However, I think it might be a good idea, since it's about 7 o'clock, to move to determine whether or not there are any other questions from the public. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith, for bringing it all home for us. We are certainly not done. We have a number of questions that we are going to get to. If you have some questions, you can just put them down in the chat and we will pick them up as they are posted. I'm going to open this one up to anyone. I'm going to read it because I do think it's prevalent amongst the working force here in Bermuda, and that's largely due to our small working environment. You know, Bermuda, everyone kind of knows everyone. It's that sort of mentality, and you'll understand. Here's why. I have been bullied for many years by my boss, but there is no real recourse for staff. This is because the senior management team is a clique. They all hang out together and some vacation together. The person you should the person you should report bullying to is a part of that clique. So people suffer in silence out of fear of being labeled or fired if they speak up. What are the options to hold companies accountable? In most cases, these new policies are just a checklist. There is no real change. And I'd like to highlight that this person says the company accountable, because we talked about holding the individual perpetrators accountable. And what is being highlighted here is the clique and how it's perpetuating the issue where we don't want to speak up. We feel like it's going to be retaliation or nothing gets done. So what are the options to hold the companies accountable?
So that's actually an excellent question, and because that person feels as though they're in a helpless situation. And so the first step is the established policies should have clear guidelines in place for what happens when senior management are the ones that are actually the perpetrators. If the policies do not have clear guidelines as to what to do when senior managers are the perpetrators, then what we're asking individuals to do is go to the labor relations department and make a formal complaint with the labor relations department. Additional to that, if it is based off any of the discriminatory items that fall underneath the Human Rights Commission, they can also make a complaint to the Human Rights Commission. There is strength also, which is found in the occupational health and safety, and it talks about individuals not feeling comfortable in their work environment because of number of risk. And bullying and harassment and having a toxic work environment that is harmful to one's health can fall within that category as well. And so there is levels of additional recourse that employees can utilize if they feel as though they cannot go to senior management. But a sound policy would have a procedure in place to directly guide employees if senior management is actually the ones that are doing the perpetrating.
So, Antonia,
Yeah, go ahead.
I believe the person that asked the question has done a lot of employers a big favor, because it's a critical question to ask, especially when you have so many small or tightly held companies. And I spoke that it's up to management. Government has done their part. It's now up to government to put the proper structures in place. And I will also draw a comparison to what's happened in the US. And Bermuda tends to run 15 or 20 years behind the US. But for those of us who have worked in the US, sexual harassment and other harassment has been a major training and development piece and a presence in the workforce for a very long time. And one place that I worked at was Michigan State University. And over the past 2 or 3 years, they've been very much front and center for a sexual harassment case that was brought forward by about 150 women that dated back over 30 years. And ultimately, the organization, the school, the university was held accountable for systemic harassment violations. And the lawsuit that was settled was over $1 billion, okay? So if you have an organization today that facilitates systemic abuse and it goes to court, you can still be held accountable at the management level as well as at the board level and possibly at the pocket level. Because these things do trickle across jurisdictions, and we know the US has massive jury-based settlements. But certainly you can look in the Bermuda courts and see what's happening in the UK courts, migrating over to Bermuda, and eventually we catch up. So
to add to that?
And certainly,
I would also say we also have to remember that there is always power in in coming together. So in that company I referenced before, the decision was made by the employees that, we're going to effectively withdraw our labor. We're going to say that this is no longer something that we're prepared to tolerate. We, talk to managers, we talk to HR, and this is no longer something that we're going to wait for someone to come and put some things in place when we've already addressed this again and again. And so I often come back to the point of people have options. And one of those things is really talking around, what are we willing to accept? So there's two pieces to that. One, they can't let go of everybody. And two, realistically, it's really important for an organization to decide whether they are actually going to get behind this or not. And when you are an organization that says, hey, we're actually going to take this seriously, then that shifts for everybody involved in it. As I said, that company that I first referenced had a terrible company culture when it came to bullying and harassment. And so that went from managers, all the way down. And by that 5-year mark that I had talked about half of their management team had let go, because they were now able to say, people were able to say, hey, hold on, our policy says this, and there's supposed to be an investigation process, and someone's supposed to get back to me within 90 days. I can prove, here's my own paper trail that proves I filed this complaint and nothing has happened. And so the more that there are policies put in place, even if the organization itself is not willing to make that shift, employees are now able to hold organizations accountable to, this is what your policy says, this is what's in our employee handbook, this is what the law says, and really start enforcing changes from the ground up.
Thank you.
And I think also too, I think also as a union, we have collective power, right? And so we can hold organizations accountable through the use of our collective power. I think it's also important to recognize that sometimes people feel like they are the only persons experiencing what is happening. And some of the things that we found is, once a person brings that complaint to the union, certainly to the rapid response officer, and we start our investigation, we begin to see that there are more people who have experienced it. And the more people we get together, it offers a sense of comfort, because it doesn't necessarily stay an individual complaint, but now it becomes a group complaint that is supported by the union. And you have to trust that the process is that we will not settle for anything except a change of behavior. And now that we have the legislations, and companies know that in addition to what we can put on the table, the law backs it up. But collective power is powerful. And there have been cases where we have used our collective power to really draw attention to toxic environments.
I might add that, and underscore the fact that the legislation has now made it extremely important for businesses to comply with the law. Most businesses should, should and do comply with the law. And this has highlighted the need to do so. So the business that you described that might be I might have had an employee and treated them the way they did, or several employees the way they did, that'll soon be the thing of the past as cases come to light and are dealt with underneath the legislation.
Thank
But
you, everyone.
I also want to say this before you go on, because I think one of the things that the person who asked the question was highlighting, right? That in small countries, the person that you're reporting to is a friend of your cousin who dates this person and dates that person. We're all connected in some way through family, friends, or association, right? But there is a zero tolerance. It does not matter who that connection is. Each of those people will be held accountable if they fail to act. And I think that's an important point. If you fail to act, you're not just letting down that employee, but you are failing to act on behalf of the company. and managers who fail to act are also subject to the disciplinary code.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone who just commented on that question. Minister Hayward, I believe this one would be better suited for you. Why was the new legislation not put under the Human Rights Commission Act to give it more teeth?
And so actually, putting it this way is actually stronger, because once you put it under the Human Rights Act, you have to then prove it's based off of discriminatory grounds. And so the beauty is the policy is rooted in terms of the Employment Act, but that doesn't prevent or prohibit anybody from utilizing the mechanisms that are built within the Human Rights Act. And so there is teeth to employers ensuring that they have policies, and employers can actually be fined if they don't comply with the law pertaining to the policies. I think what persons would like to see is if an employer is found accused of bullying harassment, then the employer can be penalized according to law. And I think that is the strength in which persons would ultimately like to see when they say more teeth. But this is to ensure that there are policies in place within the workplace that highlight behaviors which fall under both misconduct and gross misconduct, and persons can be held accordingly based off of the workplace policies. But I'll allow Lisa to speak to the nuance between the Employment Act and the Human Rights Act.
Thank you, Minister. Lisa, when you're ready. Nope, not yet. Try again. No, unfortunately, we cannot hear you yet. No worries. I will go ahead and ask one more question and we will come back to you. Sorry, put myself on mute. Yep. This one is open to whomever would like to come to the stage. How does the Immigration Department monitor and address any grievances made by Bermudian workers? Immigration Department.
So that's different from the scope of conversation we're discussing, but work permit holders are held to the same standard that Bermudian employees are held to within the workplace. And so the policy applies to all. As it pertains to bullying and sexual harassment in the workplace, the appropriate place to have those complaints are within your workplace, but that doesn't prohibit you from going to the Labor Relations section or the Human Rights Commission for assistance. Additionally, we must say that sexual assault is also a criminal offense. And so if one is sexually assaulted in the workplace, they can also go to the police. But any complaints pertaining to any employee should follow the policy that is put in place within the workplace.
Thank you, Minister. There are a number of questions that are advocating for guest workers, permit holders, and the comments center around them being afraid really to make a comment or complaint on bullying or sexual harassment in fear of getting their work permits revoked. And you just spoke to that, but I wonder if there is any alternative support for them, the guest worker who may be suffering said harassment or bullying. I believe Letitia mentioned earlier that there are counseling services to help employees go through that when they feel that they have no recourse. In this case, I totally hear you when we say we want the action to stop, but in the event that it doesn't, what is the escalation process?
So that's really helpful actually, because I've had people who've come in and said, you know, we would like some support to kind of just think this out for a minute so I can think about what my options are before I even make a complaint. You know, just making sense of, you know, what could possibly happen, what could this mean for me? Or I've made a complaint and I'm really anxious right now. Can someone support me on this? Or, you know, I made a complaint and actually someone got let go and I kind of feel guilty about that. Whatever that looks like, you know, it's really important when someone's going through this kind of process that there's real support for it on both sides, to be honest, that there's support for the person who's being victimized and support for the person who has, you know, done this behavior, because we often have to remember that many people act out of what they know, what their own comfort level is. So someone who is bullying in the workplace may be someone who has bullied from childhood, you know, has been a bully in high school, is now a bully in your job, and this is the first place that they're being held accountable for this behavior. And so it's helpful to have a space not only in your policy that says this is the disciplinary that comes next to it, but this is the support that comes next to it, and it can range. I've seen some companies where they have offered things like mental health days for the victim to kind of, you know, wrap their head around what's happening. I've seen some organizations where they have mandated anger management classes, where they have mandated, you know, sexual harassment training, whatever that looks like, but making sure that it's not just strictly disciplinary, but that there's support added to it as well, because you're talking about not just organizational shifts, but behavior shifts and mindset shifts, as Linda said earlier. And mindset shifts are really about understanding someone's past and how that behavior has led to this moment. And so counseling is a very important arm in an organization's repertoire of really helping people to understand how to do things better. And so I think, especially if you have an EAP, that should be something that you're looking at when you're drafting these kind of policies or amending these kind of policies, to make sure that there is a support section that really speaks to how do we help this organizational shift to not just happen, but continue.
And certainly also, if a guest worker has made a complaint of bullying and harassment or sexual harassment, and they go through the process, and as a result, if it, say, the suspect was their or the bully or the harasser was their frontline manager, who then has the responsibility to decide whether or not their work permit is going to be renewed. If a otherwise good worker has all of a sudden had their work permit not renewed, and they believe that it is as a result of the complaint that they made, the union is prepared to challenge it. And we have done it before. And so we encourage those persons. Listen, you're talking about persons who have left their country, left their support system, have come to another country, and maybe to make a better life for themselves and to work, and then they're subjected to this wave of harassment. And so initially, to this country is to take advantage of an opportunity. So you're going to be afraid of losing that opportunity. But at the same time, from a human factor, you want better for yourself, and you should not be subjected to bullying or harassment under any circumstances. And so the union has had a lot of dialogue around this with some of our stakeholders to say that we will challenge those cases where we believe that a person is being re-victimized by being penalized to have their work permit ended by the person who was responsible for bullying and harassment. So we've encouraged them to put steps in place to be able to look at it and have an independent person also be responsible for looking at that, the process of renewal work permits.
Thank you. I believe Keith wanted to come to the stage.
Oh, just as another example, we had a situation where a Bermudian employee was harassing non-Bermudian employees, threatening to go to the immigration department and have their work permit withdrawn if they did not do what she said. And that issue was resolved satisfactorily, and because there was no way that the ministry was going to act in that manner based upon that individual's threat. So consequently, in dealing with these matters head-on by management is certainly the way to go. And utilizing the resources of the EAP is a great help in these matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Scott, did you want to add to it?
Sure, on two levels. One, managers and owners or leaders have to know their environment. So they should have an understanding of what's taking place in the organization. And if you have work permit holders and there's even rumors that that's taking place, you need to build in those relief and safety valves beforehand. And that's also ensuring that human resources or whoever's carrying out the human resources function has the autonomy to act and to hold persons to account. Because again, if HR is just going to pay lip service and push things under the carpet and not act responsibly, then you're going to continue the exposure of those individuals. And another point that Letitia made is bully leadership, okay? And it's critical that as we grow and develop our organization, we take that performance review process very seriously. We take the development of our talent very seriously, because if you have someone who's acting as a bully and you promote that person, guess what? They're going to be a bully manager as well. And they're going to create more problems, and they're going to add to the systemic risks that I'm pretty sure that you as a leader of the organization do not want to foster or inherit. So you have to start to manage this at the staff level and through your entire vertical.
Antonia, just on that, so there's no time, is it appropriate for a manager to make reference to one's employment status via work permit that has no bearing in the day-to-day operations of an organization?
Thank you, Minister. At this time, I'd like to bring back on Lisa. Lisa, if you unmute yourself, let's see if it works this time.
Can you hear me?
Yes, it worked.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to reiterate the importance of bringing forward a complaint to the Human Rights Commission, where an individual feels that they are being discriminated against, whether through harassing behaviors or sexual harassment. The individual should come to the commission. At the same time, they can still also go to the Department of Workforce Development, because both the Human Rights Commission as well as Workforce Development have screening functions. And so where there are allegations that do not identify where an action is discriminatory, they can, if they as well log their complaint with Workforce Development, then they can continue with their action. So it's just really important to speak up. And within the Human Rights Act, within our legislation, there is protection from reprisal as well. So we just simply encourage that you come forward. And of course, we do recognize that there are sensitivities around logging complaints. It's not easy. Someone can be in crisis. And so it's just simply important that you come forward so that someone can assist.
Thank you, Lisa. I'd like to ask this question, and Linda, you touched on this earlier. The question is there a way for an employee to discreetly make a claim of bullying or sexual harassment in the workplace? And I think what's important here is to really understand the purpose behind the complaint. And if it's discreet, does that mean there will be no reprimand in the person who is doing the bullying or the sexual harassing? And then also on the flip side of that, will something be done to that person if the complainant does not reveal the identity?
I mean, certainly it's a sensitive, topic, right? And so, but at the end of the day, in order to be able to move something to a result, there has to be a certain amount of ownership. And so the initial complaint certainly can be discreet. You can reach out to myself as the rapid response officer, or you can reach out to a shop steward and they will inform you of the process. But you cannot expect to make a complaint about a person and not take ownership of that person, because we represent all parties in this matter sometimes. Mm-hmm. And so we want the fair process to go, because there have also been cases where there have been false complaints, right? But the most important thing is it's about the empowerment for us, is to empower the person to want to stand up for themselves and ensure them that there will be a result. And again, it gets back to, well, what does that result look like? It may be that the person doesn't get fired. It could be that the person gets fired if they're an habitual offender. But it certainly should be that the action stops. And if the action doesn't stop, then we will continue to pursue it until the action stops. There have been times when we have received complaints from persons, and just like in the courts, they don't want to go through the process. And that's why we also do the investigation process when it becomes obvious to us and evidence supports that there are a number of victims, then we can then do group actions. So it's about the encouragement, it's about the empowerment, and it's about really reminding people that they have an absolute right not to work in these environments. And confidentiality is important. And that's why I think in those cases where you have this independent person that may not necessarily be working with the whole group of individuals involved, it can be very effective.
I might make a quick comment, if I might. One is that the person that is complained about has a right to some level of natural justice as well. If they're being complained about, they need to know that that complaint exists, and so on. And that's only a natural course of events in Bermuda. The second point is that even if the complainant does not wish to pursue it and has aired its views, within the template that's produced by the ministry, the employer has to take action of some type, even if the individual does not wish to file a formal complaint. So that is embodied in the template that's produced by the ministry. So
it speaks to how the information received from the complainant should be held in confidence. Certainly has a process of natural justice where it has to be shared with the person who is being accused of the behavior. But what I've seen in terms of what I call gold standard policies is that they even have independent investigation procedures. So sometimes individuals investigating the complaints of third parties and not necessarily always within an organization. And so there are a number of ways and mechanisms to protect that level of discreetness and confidentiality within the workplace. But that's what we want to see. We want to see an environment where people are comfortable with making these complaints so that the behavior in the workplace can actually stop.
Thank you, Minister. Lisa and then Letitia.
So I also wanted to reinforce that Section 14H1C of the Human Rights Act sets out that a complaint shall be filed within 6 months of the alleged contravention. However, the executive officer may entertain a complaint up to 2 years after an alleged contravention if satisfied there are 1, good reasons for the delay, and 2, that no one will be prejudiced for the delay. Filing a complaint within the limitation period is strongly encouraged. However, we recognize that there may be instances where people may not want to pursue a claim or where there's a justifiable reason for the delay in reporting. The risk in delaying the filing of a complaint is that there may be either no good reasons for the delay, or a potential respondent may be able to demonstrate that they have suffered prejudice by the delay, which could result in a complaint being considered time barred. So again, just reiterating the importance of bringing forth a claim in a reasonable time frame.
Thank you, Lisa.
I wanted to just briefly speak to the power of witnesses, because sometimes when you're the person being bullied, you may not feel empowered to make a statement. You may worry about how it's going to directly impact on you or your career or what people are going to think. And I think it's really important as an organization to really reinforce that one person's issue is everyone's issue. And if we see something, you go back to see something, say something, and that has real merit in the work environment. I know one organization where the person themselves who was being bullied did not want to lay the complaint, but actually how it moved forward, where there were so many people who saw what was happening that they actually went forth and they went to HR and they, and so the investigation took on a life of its own and the situation ended up being resolved quite well. And so that person never had to feel, no one is supporting me. In fact, because so many people got involved, it created a culture where everyone at that organization was able to say, hold on, we are not going to say that this is okay in our organization, and we are going to look out for each other. And so it's really important that we remember it's not one person's problem. When you have an issue with bullying and harassment, it is an organizational problem, and everyone from, the first employee to the last employee hired is responsible for the workplace culture. It is not just a management issue. And so really the onus is on management to make sure that people understand that not only are we going to enforce the law, not only are we going to have great policies, but we are also going to support people who are being impacted or who are watching and are also being impacted by being a witness, and that we're going to action things. Because realistically, people are looking to see, can they trust the organization to handle this in an appropriate way? And so from the very first time this comes across your door, how you choose to address this, whether you sweep it under the line, whether you actually use it as a teaching, moment in your organization, has real impact. And so there are people who are on this, this Zoom session, who will watch it later, who are living this right now, and they're waiting for their organizations to step up and show them that this is a real change. And so as a leader myself, I am encouraging other leaders to show your employees that you are serious about this, because they take their cues from you.
Thank you, Letitia. Ladies and gentlemen, we are coming up on the 1.5 hour mark. At this time, I'm going to ask just a few more questions, and then I will welcome our speakers to provide summary comments limited to 2 minutes each, and perhaps how people can get in touch with you if they need support through the various topics we talked about tonight. Linda, if I may invite you, please, to give us some examples on overt bullying versus bullying that is not easily identifiable.
Thank you. So we all know what blatant bullying is, right? When people specifically target you. But that bullying that is difficult to identify is what we call when people use other people as their tool to bully you. So it comes from those situations when You are the only person that isn't invited to any of the functions. You are the only person who they never ask, can I get you something, something part of the lunch run? You are the only person that is expected, because of that click mentality, to stay later every day and meet on unrealistic targets. Sometimes those are very difficult to put under the bullying and harassment, right? And they're also difficult to prove. Also, a case would be due to performance appraisal. Certainly management has the right to do appraisals on their employees, but when they start to do it in a way where they are picking on issues that really is, everybody is doing it, but they are only targeting you as an individual, and then you're told to keep your performance appraisals confidential, and then you realize by a slip or having a general conversation with somebody else that you're expected to do things in your performance appraisal that others who are on the same job are not expected to do, right? And so this is where these are the type of bullying and harassment cases that are sometimes difficult for us, because managers try to put it under management's right to manage. Let's do a real example. We now know that because of the pandemic, some departments, some organizations have work from home policies, right? So because you have been an employee that either the manager didn't like or just never vibed with, your application to work from home is flatly denied. Even though you have all of the tools and opportunities and access as somebody else. And everybody else in that department is given the option to work from home, but you are not given the option. When you report it to say, listen, this is targeting me. And it's in addition to bullying and harassment I've been experienced over a period of time. And then management says, well, it's because Antonia doesn't have computers at her house, or doesn't have Wi-Fi at her house, or the nature of work that she does is XYZ. And so you start to find that it requires further investigation, it requires timelines, it requires actions. And this is why we always tell persons, make sure that you start records of documentation. Records of documentation. It's important to keep these records. Put it in your cell phone, write it on your notepad, but start timeline records of evidence so that when you are ready to make those complaints, you're able to produce documentation. That is very important. Let's also talk about those things when we make statements and then we laugh about it. When we talk about those people or people like you, right? And then everybody laughs about it. And then when confronted, the person says, oh no, I meant something totally different from what everybody understood. And because of the reaction, it impacted the person. And if you're constantly in a toxic environment like that, then it will start to impact you. One thing that I want to say, really why it's critical, right? Because productivities of departments, productivity of workspaces is crucial to the success of those departments and or the services they offer to the public. So employers, managers that fail to address these things are causing damage to the productivity of that company and that stakeholder. And lack of productivity affects income. And so these are the bigger impacts that not addressing bullying and harassment could have on a person and a company.
Thank you, Linda. We have had a number of questions that we were unable to get to tonight just due to the time. but we invite you to reach out to the Labor Relations Department or any one of our panelists tonight. As we move towards closing remarks, I would invite the panelists to just share their contact details of the organization or yourselves with people and how they can get in touch with you. And we will finish with Minister Hayward. Letitia?
Good evening. Thank you so much for having us. We at EAP Bermuda can be reached at info@eap.bm or by phone 292-9000. Email is probably most efficient. And again, it is info employee culture, training opportunities. We are here to be a part of it. So actually, really quickly as a last thought, we did have a company that reached you of sexual harassment, and they actually joined EAP as a member just because they needed to deal with this issue. And because of how it was really addressed with the person who was accused, with the person who was a victim, it really did help with their company in strengthening their policy. So it's never too late. Please don't be, necessarily waiting until it's already at your doorstep. But if you don't have an EAP and it does come to your doorstep, even then it's not too late.
Thank you, Letitia. I'd like to invite Keith.
Thank you for that. I'll be brief. I can be reached at K Jensen, the letter K, then JENSEN at bec.bm. Once again, it's K Jensen at bec.bm. And tonight's been a most useful exercise to get these issues out front and center in the community. And I'd like to thank the Ministry for putting this together, and the panelists for being so forthright. One of the things I was, not by way of summary, was to mention that romance in the workplace, it can be one good thing, but when it goes sour, it can easily turn into issues of sexual harassment and issues of bullying. So that kind of topic may be for the next panel and the next forum, if there was to be one in the future. There are two approaches that basically end up in this arena. One is the mediation, solution, problem-solving method, which I think everybody would prefer, and get the problem solved and dealt with, and the organization moves on to better days. And secondly, there's the legal approach, the legal matter, a way to deal with things. There are advantages and disadvantages to both of them. Thank everyone for making it a worthwhile evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Linda?
Thank you. So if you need me personally as the rapid response officers and you fall under our membership or our bargaining unit, even if you don't, you just need someone to talk to, pick up the phone. You can call me at 300-8380 and you can get some advice around this matter. Also, you can call our union, the Bermuda Public Services Union, at 292-6985 or email us at info@bpsu.bm. My email address is indale, INDALE, @bpsu.bm. Listen, at the end of the day, there's a lot going on in the world right now, a lot. And the last thing we need as individuals is to come into the workplace where we spend a considerable amount of time as workers and be exposed to environments that are toxic, be exposed to bullying and harassment. We want it to stop. We can put all the policies in place that we want, and the policies have penalties. But as human beings, we need to be intentional about how we treat each other how we treat each other. And when we see that we are not treating someone properly, then we must commit to make the change. When we see that others aren't treating someone properly, then we need to be the person that puts up our hand and say, not in my presence, not in my presence. I will be that person that stands up and says, this is not the place for that. And please know, I will not tolerate it on behalf of myself, but also on behalf of my fellow workers. It is all of our responsibilities. The legislation is only a tool for those people who are resistant and who refuse to make change. But imagine the impact it could have if we all decided that enough was enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Lisa?
Again, I'd also like to reiterate our appreciation for being invited this evening. And the way we see it is that this is certainly the beginning of much more collaboration between many stakeholder groups.
Lisa, I'm sorry to interject. Your volume is quite low at the moment. Could you possibly adjust it, please?
Can you hear me clearly now?
It's a tad bit better, but not.
Okay, I will speak loudly. I was saying that this is certainly the continuation of much more collaboration between many stakeholder organizations, and as well an opportunity for organizations and individuals to understand and better understand their rights. And I just wanted to also say one comment, and just really quickly, that there is a distinction between consensual relationships and sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is a violation of the Human Rights Act.
Thank you, Lisa. And how can people contact the Human Rights Commission, yourself, or the regular info page?
Sure. They can contact the Human Rights Commission. If they wish to make a complaint or a query, they can email hrc_intakes@gov.bm or email us at humanrights@gov.bm, or they can contact us by phone at 295-5859.
Thank you, Lisa. Scott?
Certainly. So first of all, I would like to thank Minister Hayward and his team for implementing the changes to the legislation, as well as having this panel discussion this evening. I think it's set the bar. However, I think the heavy lifting and the real work starts now, and that's going to fall to organizations as well as all of their employees. All of us who lead organizations, whether they're for profit or for delivering of public services, I believe strive to have high performance organizations. And therefore, we must lead this initiative from the top. If it's not being led from the top, then those who abuse will continue to abuse, and those who are victims will continue to be victims. The legislation unto itself is not going to solve any issues. It will help, but it's not going to solve. So it's important that we continue to deliver on the policies and procedures. Make sure we empower HR. Do not use HR as your henchman or your cover up. Okay, retain EAP. Use your union representatives if you have them. Even create a union environment if you need to, if that's going to help. And certainly make sure that you empower your employees and give them the resources and support so that they could feel safe in the workplace. And as Linda said, in order to have a productive workplace, your employees have to feel safe in that environment. If anyone has any questions, they can feel free to contact me here at the Bermuda Hospitals Board. My email is scott.pearman@bhb.bm. Whether you're an employee or whether you're another organization, and certainly either myself or I have a strong team in human resources that knows this material very well, and we can certainly provide you with more background information, templates or whatnot. So thank you again.
Thank you, Scott. And ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you for joining us this evening for this very important conversation. It was my honor to be your moderator tonight. Special thank you to each of our guest speakers who brought a wealth of knowledge and expertise amongst all of them. I believe we all have a much better understanding on the intention of this new legislation, and collectively, we have the power to make the changes we need, and it begins with our mindset and changing within our respective organizations. In closing, I'd like to bring on Minister Hayward.
Thank you, Antonia, and thank you to all the panelists tonight who contributed to this awesome national discussion on workplace bullying and sexual harassment. Part of our aim from the Ministry of Labor standpoint is to raise awareness on this particular issue. So we will certainly be continuing in our partnerships and our dialogue on this particular matter, because we recognize that cultural and paradigm shifts need to take place within workplaces. Additional to that, we also want to ensure employees that they have the necessary support from the government. The policy requirements in the legislation was designed to better protect employees in the workplace. That cannot be lost. So moving forward, we will be also providing additional tips that employees can utilize to support them through their journey in the workplace. And lastly, I'd like to say that our ultimate aim, like Sister Linda articulated, is for the behaviors to simply stop. Everybody should work in a dignified work environment, free of workplace bullying and harassment. So again, to all the panelists, I'd like to say thank you. Antonia, thank you. And Bermuda, stay tuned for the next conversation. I think that there's room to specifically talk about topics such as sexual harassment in the workplace and some other negative behaviors that we find very common on our shores. And so the dialogue will continue.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you, everyone. Have a safe and wonderful evening.